Joined. So good afternoon. Welcome to the second session on this second day of FIPP Insider New Zealand. Thanks for joining us once again. It's 1:30 p.m. in New Zealand. It's about 2:30 in the morning here in the UK. And on behalf of FIPP and our strategic partners Press Reader and of course the Magazine Publishers Association of New Zealand, thank you once again for joining us. So we had a fascinating first session this afternoon rather, with Gavin Ellis, talking about all things media in New Zealand and across the world. And now we're going to dive more deeply into the state of the overall market and the economy here in, or where you are, in New Zealand. Sally Duggan, Executive Director of the MPA, is your host for this session. But before I hand over to her, just a final word on our session this afternoon, the last one of the day. At 4 p.m, we're going to hear from Nikolai Malyarov, International CEO of our partners at Press Reader. He'll be telling us the latest trends in content consumption and how this has changed as a result of the coronavirus crisis. It does contain some fascinating and fantastic insights, and I would thoroughly recommend you join us for that. And of course, you can meet Nick as well as any of the delegates through the deal room. Don't forget to go and book meetings with your fellow delegates. A reminder that all you need to do is look at the participants list and click the Meet button at the bottom, send them a message, and they will suggest a time. You can then hold the meeting through the deal room platform. I would encourage you once again to take advantage of this option, book a meeting with one of your fellow delegates, and of course with our friends at Press Reader. The deal room platform will remain open for about a week after the event finishes, so don't be afraid to book a meeting for later this week or next. As we said earlier, today's sessions are all interactive. We're keen to hear from as many of you as possible, so please don't be afraid to ask questions and we'll answer them as best we can. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see both Q&A and chat buttons, and you can use these throughout the event. Please submit your questions and upvote questions from others that you would like to see answered, and keep an eye on the chat box for useful links and information from the FIPP team. A reminder once again that if you're enjoying these sessions and would like another opportunity to hear from world-class speakers on a variety of subjects, then don't forget to sign up to the forthcoming FIPP Congress. Starting on September 2nd and running across the whole month, this will feature something like 70 separate sessions that you can attend. Links to the agenda and how to sign up are appearing in the chat. Please also do feel free to contact the FIPP or MPA teams throughout the event if you have any questions or comments. I am at james@fipp.com and Sally can be reached at sally@mpa.org.nz. So now it's time for me to hand over to your host for today, Executive Director of the MPA, Sally Duggan. So take it away, Sally.
Thank you and welcome all, and I hope our panel turns up before we start the session. Yes, well, I guess as media people, our job, first and foremost, is to grab our readers' attention with compelling content that's engaging. And to do that well, it really helps if we understand what they're thinking about and what's pressing their buttons. The idea behind this panel session then was to get some answers to that question, what's happening out there? What are Kiwis thinking about? What's on their minds at the moment? So we've lined up 3 research experts to share their insights into how COVID-19 has impacted on what Kiwis are thinking about and feeling, how they shop, how they use media, and so on. So each of these experts are going to talk for a few minutes and then they'll answer questions. They'll do that one at a time, and then if there's time at the end, we'll open up for a more general discussion at the end. As always, though, we're really keen for questions from the floor, so send those in at any time and we'll interject and fit them in as soon as we can. So to start with them, first up, we've got Jason Schoeman. Now, Jason heads up the Media Insights team at Kantar, New Zealand. He spent more than 10 years working with many of New Zealand's biggest businesses. Kantar is one of the world's largest customer research providers. They've got a presence in over 90 countries. They've been very, very active during the pandemic, doing research, and they have some really interesting insights to share. So Jason, over to you.
Right. Oh, thanks for the introduction there, Sally. Let's just catch up, just see the presentation on screen there. Right, so if we just move on to the first slide, and because what I think is obviously clear is that COVID created a huge amount of disruption. But when we take a look at this and take a look at the consumer reaction behind it, and then how we can advise brands, businesses in New Zealand how to respond to those disruptions, a really important thing to stop and take check of is trying to understand which of those are going to be continuous and which ones of those are quite sporadic. So what's important to understand is that disruptions of the scale will unearth a whole bunch of change, but what's really key to look at is sort of what changes relate to existing underlying trends, and how a disruption such as this and the way we live our life can go on to affect the way we live our life in the future, and how we can make some of those emerging trends more mainstream. So through our research, and so we did a lot of research during COVID, mainly because there's a huge business appetite for it up front. But then we started to realize everything was changing so fast. So we did 13 waves of quantitative tracking and 7 waves of qualitative tracking. And what I present today are some very high level insights that we uncovered. And if you are interested in more, you can get in touch, or visit our website and you'll find out more information on a more detailed deck. But if we just flick onto the next slide, Sally, and what I'll talk to here is one of the first 2 key changes that we saw in consumers' values. So as we moved into COVID, I'm sure many of you, like I and many of my clients, kind of realized we're thrust into this position where we actually had a whole bunch more time than we had previously had in the past. For many businesses, we were thrust into an environment where we had an abundance of time, and this was true for consumers as well. And when they went through this experience and they started to understand what they could do with that time and started to reflect on that, what we saw is quite a change in a reassessment of what they value. And so what I've got grouped up here is sort of 3 key groups that we saw. But almost universally, what we saw is consumers in New Zealand wanted these things to continue. And a lot of this was about work-life balance, that first column there, taking more emphasis on conscious health and conscious family time. In the middle there, we got more of the independent mindset, but it's around more me time, a slower pace of life. And then again, another family column there again, but you bring in that time for family. But what you get emerging across all of these 3 groups is a much greater sense of the importance of myself, my friends, and my family to the way I live my life, and what demands that may place on me in the way I interact with businesses, in the sense of how I interact and purchase the brands I like. My time is suddenly much more important, but also the way I interact with my employer, and how my time becomes more important. But it's not just for me personally, it's the way I can use that time for those around me. I think when we consider the context in which, or the environment in which we were asked to go into as part of COVID lockdown, it really did rest on the power to collective people, and it seems to have a profound impact on the way in which people have behaved over the last sort of 15, 16 weeks, and how they look to adopt some of these behaviours going forward into the future. So if we just flick to the next slide there, Sally, and this next slide is the second value. And what we saw around a lot of the things that people want to continue to do in the future, when we align this against much of the other work we've done in the past on client-specific projects, the values that come through here again relate to a genuine sense of New Zealandness, or a more inclusive acceptance and fairness component. And this is something what relates us to New Zealandness in the global brand work we do. What we also see is a rise in the importance of businesses and the social good that they provide. I was writing a report late last year on sort of developing CEO's reputation, and what came out as sort of a key emerging trend there, which I sort of touch on here because it has quite a few similarities, but it's around the idea of that CEO having strong purpose a personal mission in a way that they could show how what they were doing and what their business was doing was larger than what just their business is. So again, reflecting the business's role in that collective. So if we just flick to the next slide now, and we move away from values and going to move into behaviours that we saw change in a second. But one thing I did want to touch on, and we'll touch on when we're advising our clients, yes, this COVID situation was almost unprecedented. The level of constraint that we had on life and the potential for change is massive. But a whole bunch of stuff is going to remain constant after this. And while we'll talk predominantly about stuff that's changed today, and I've got a few more changes to talk about, don't want that sort of just to dominate your view, because I think it's really important to keep stock of those things, and so many things will remain constant, because those things that remain constant remain incredibly important when it comes to setting business strategy and thinking about where to go next. So if we just flick to the next slide, what I highlight here is, through that research, what we did, just 6 major behaviours that we observed through the COVID lockdown. And many of you, like I, can relate to most of these, significantly impacting my life and the way I lived through those, 8 weeks of lockdown and then the subsequent stages afterwards. But some of these changes are going to be much more short-term, and some of them will endure. And so on the last slide that I just got to talk to today, Sally, we sort of present, and based on what we know, so if we just flick now to the next slide, the 2 key behavioural changes that we need to take stock of as New Zealand marketers and factor into our future decision making is this notion around flexible working and what that's going to mean for consumers' behaviours, their media habits, incredibly important for this audience, and then that notion and that rise of buying local. And I think a big part of why that is seen as both a large stated intention to change, it's something that's heavily in the press today, but likely to continue to change in the future, because that ties heavily into the idea of the collective. And the rise in importance around the power of the collective and how we're able to come together as a nation, as a large group of people, and achieve something that was quite remarkable. And for all the people and all the New Zealanders who took part in that, there is the sense of a great deal of pride in what we achieved as a nation. We were directed by the government, but at the end of the day, what was achieved in eliminating COVID was down to the commitment of the collective. It was the commitment of the people. It was a job that we all as New Zealanders got in behind and got done. And so I believe that it's going to be a strong theme and what will drive that greater desire for buying local or supporting brands that support local. I think the one last thing I touch on that point, because it's easy to get wrapped up, and potentially I probably could have labelled that chart better, but it's not just being New Zealand made. New Zealand made gives you a natural avenue to have a conversation with the New Zealander in that aspect. But what they're looking for is more than that. What they're looking for is brands that are involved in support, not only brands and businesses that are supporting them and the New Zealand community. So a New Zealand made brand can not fulfill their responsibilities there. This purely just acting as a commercial entity, and they don't demonstrate how they give back to the wider New Zealand or their local community. But likewise, international players can play in that space still by demonstrating how they can give back to New Zealanders, how they can give back to New Zealand communities. So it's not just a strict avenue for New Zealand-owned businesses.
That's great. Thank you, Jason. So just picking up on what you've just been talking about, if Kiwis are increasingly wanting to buy brands that support their community, can you think specifically how media can use that, can harness that desire?
Yeah, I think because the media, or media outlets in general, perform a really important function for, like in New Zealand communities and the wider communities. And so here it doesn't actually need to be about giving back. It's not all about giving out profits. I think, and for the media industry at this point, it's really hard, right? We're in a really tough space with advertising spend being cut. But for media outlets, they have a really important function of telling the stories of New Zealanders and New Zealand communities. So being able to demonstrate that, I think, is a really powerful way that the media and the publicists in this space can play and leverage off that greater desire from the New Zealand consumer.
Okay, and another key trend was obviously this flexible working, and with more people likely to be working from home, how do you predict that will affect their media habits?
Yeah, I think the prediction is a really hard one, is a bit of crystal ball gazing. But one of those stats is 90% of people wish to work from home more, and continue what they're doing, at least in some part. And that's it's a massive number. So locally here in our office, we're now implemented a policy where people can nominate 2 of their working days to work from home. So that's now 40% of the working week. For a large chunk of our employees are choosing to take that up. But if we think about how that can change rather than predicting how it will, but I think it opens up a number of avenues. Like daytime TV watching, it is completely up in the air, because what it means when you can work from home, it means that the 9 to 5 to a certain degree disappears as well, right? The constraints around that 9 to 5 working block, it might be work early and work late, and you've got a chunk in the middle where it's house time. So does that impact media behaviours at the end of the day, or does it open up new opportunities in the middle of the day? Daytime radio, I think, is going to be incredibly fascinating, because there's more choice, more fragmented. People listen to their individual preferences rather than being wrapped into an office or a workplace. And then for the print publications, more people are going to be at home. Their print subscriptions, what they're buying, is going to be more readily to hand. There's going to be more occasions where they can pick it up, where they can have consumption. And I do wonder if it's going to lead to more sporadic consumption of media, because you now have more flexibility in when you choose to watch, or when you do choose to consume something, than when you are working a traditional 9 to 5. So it might mean they end up with smaller chunks of media, whether it be reading, listening, or watching.
And finally, how does that community desire to pull together that you've talked about, how does that mesh with the traditional role of the media to hold the government to task, particularly when we've got an election coming up?
Yeah, I think there was a number of interesting examples that played out during COVID, when we saw either media articles or moves or comments by politicians attracting quite a bit of backlash from the New Zealand public. And I think at its core, the role of the media remains much the same. What I think in those situations, what's important to understand is when those questions were being asked, and might have been asked by the government, actually what it ended up being is those questions were being seen to question the actions of all New Zealanders. So bringing it back, it wasn't just the government that enacted the lockdown, and therefore is attributable to the success of the elimination of COVID. New Zealanders take a great sense of pride in what they gave up. So questioning that approach was a questioning what they did. So when it comes to the election, or what happens from here moving on with COVID, I think people are still open to that, because while the government, the current sitting government's got a lot of its poll results speak volumes, right, that they're seen as being successfully handling it today. But equally, they will be criticised and they'll be held for account if their future actions are failing, because therefore they're going to compromise the collective actions of all New Zealanders during COVID. So it wasn't so much the media's or politicians questioning of each other, but as mentioned, it is that ownership that New Zealanders have in what we did achieve. The only other point I'll probably add, I think probably people have watched more press conferences with politicians in the last couple months and collectively over the last 10, 15 years. So
yeah, that's really true. Thanks so much for that, Jason. And next up then we've got Samantha Firsow. Now, Samantha's a market insight consultant with IRI. It's a company that many of you will know for its Aztec data that provides weekly updates on magazine sales in supermarkets. IRI provides big data and analysis for consumer packaged goods, over-the-counter healthcare organisations, retailers and media companies. Over the COVID period, Samantha has been delivering weekly insight pieces to industry, and she's going to share some of her findings with us now.
Great, perfect. If I can just have my slides up now. Perfect. Okay, great. So just a starting off slide here. So at IRI, the channels that we do cover, we're actually all classified as essential services, so have largely remained open during the pandemic. But as you can see, purchase behaviour has adjusted throughout the levels, and we've seen a real mixed bag in fortunes. Petrol, for example, was hit hard as mobility dropped, but as we've moved through the levels and become more mobile again, we've seen sales return to positivity since level 2. Route, which is our corner dairies, performed well, particularly filling out some of those out of stocks in grocery. I know that I went to my local dairy to get my gluten-free bread that my local supermarket didn't have. It also enabled ease of access, no crowds, and also winning on the back of the supporting local, which we've already heard about today. Grocery was the biggest benefactor during this time, experiencing elevated double-digit growth since the first case in February. Only since we've moved into level 2 did those growth numbers return into the single digits. And if you can see, pharmacy saw this massive panic-induced stockpiling early on as medications and over-the-counter medicines were at risk of not coming to our country. But actually, since that panic buying during lockdown, the channel really struggled to get that foot traffic to convert into sales. Now, if we start to look at the different themes on this next slide, the first one that I'm going to talk to today is this in-home consumption. So home has become this epicenter of life, and it's still playing a more central role than it did pre-COVID. According to Google residential mobility on the left there, you can see versus last year, it's up. Even as we've entered level 1 and all out-of-home services are open, people are spending out less for both health and wealth reasons. There's some key trends that we're seeing in the sales data. The home restaurant is the newest restaurant in town. Eating in became the new eating out during lockdown. And actually, since we've gone into level 1, restaurants and cafes still haven't seen those sales return back to pre-COVID levels. And in level 1, we do see the sales growth of these different themes. So whether it's trying to be a master chef at home with your herbs, spices, oils, vinegars, seasonings, or experimenting with international cuisines like Indian, Asian, perhaps wanting a splash of that travel that we're all missing out on from far off lands, or in fact the fakeaways, which is trying to replicate those takeaways at home. Tegel Takeouts have had some amazing MPD in this space with their Louisiana chicken. We've got pizzas, fish and chips, all delivering really strong growth into level 1. We've also got the home office, which we've heard a bit more about just earlier. And people and companies are starting to seriously rethink how they work. And a number of large companies are already indicating a large percentage of their workforce will work from home some of the time. And as we can see, workplace mobility is still down according to Google. In fact, if we look at coffee sales, they're still up 22%, and it's the premium options, fresh beans. People have learned how to make coffee again, and even things like coffee syrups to give it a bit more spice is up. We've got the home salon, so everyone was talking about hair colorants having peaks in sales, and actually, even though all the salons are open, hair colorant sales are still up 11%. So this starts to think about how can we help people do that grooming at home, the professional grade solutions. Home hobbies as well. The home has become the entertainment hub as well, with rekindled love of baking. It's still there as we've entered level 1. Cake needs, frozen pastries, both up 20%, flour up 11%, even after all of that stockpiling. And the last area is all about my house, my castle. We've been sitting in our rooms. I'm still sitting in my room, looking at my white walls, thinking, gosh, I need to just make it a little bit more interesting. And through supermarkets, we've seen things like picture hooks take off. DIY boom is predicted, and a lot of the articles came out yesterday. Tradies activities up. Online sales growth for these industries is also delivering. So thinking about media, how do we help attract new content around new usage, new occasions, new need states, and bringing that out-of-home experience indoors. The next kind of area we have also touched on previously, but it's around low-touch living. So social distancing has been hammered home to us, and we are seeing behavioural changes emerge. We've got this fear of going out. So Kiwis are actually making fewer, larger trips to stock up on groceries. And 1/3 of us plan to continue this behavior in the future. One of the reasons is general anxiety around going out due to COVID, but the other is around managing those shopping budgets. And we are seeing increased usage of lists, which means more rigid shopping behavior and less dwell time in store. So what does that mean from a magazine perspective? Well, less opportunities for categories to get in baskets impulsively. We've seen online commerce surge as people's preference has been to stay home and do big shops. New Zealand grocery and liquor online sales grew by 46% in May. And actually 1/4 of us Kiwis expect to continue buying online into the future. And the last section, virtual living, well, I'm at home and it looks like most of my colleagues on this panel are at home. We are living a more digital existence. We're all Zooming in today after all. And the next area is all around kind of care and community, and care starts with ourselves. And one of the adjustments we saw during lockdown was really this heightened focus on self-care as we've moved. And as we've moved into level 1, we want to sustain these new positive habits, which Jason was talking about. Protection and prevention has a newfound importance as we try and avoid infection. And we're seeing this clearly in sales data: gloves still up, cleaners, sanitizers, personal wash, but also around immune boosting products, including ingredients like vitamin C and gut health related health foods as well, all being elevated. Look, COVID has created significant amounts of stress and anxiety around key basic needs. And so pretty much all of us are worried about COVID and our economy. So we will be looking for help to get us through, and antidotes to reality, indulgences, perhaps magazines for and media for escapism. And loving local, Kiwi shoppers are really wanting to support businesses and our community. We're all in this together, and New Zealand retailers and leaders are all championing this drive for local. And we are seeing migration to local brands, and smaller manufacturers are also gaining share.
That's great.
And just, sorry, one more last slide there. It's just around the economic mindset. There are 2 crises playing out, which we need to be mindful of. Kiwis are more mindful of the longer term economic impacts on our life, much more so than the health impacts. And the recessionary mindset is really clear as we lack confidence about our future financial situation. And what we're starting to see is that households are already recalibrating their spending. Private labels winning as a more economic option. We're seeing trading down. We're starting to see different pack sizes come in, bigger, more economic pack sizes, and those types of things. So yeah, that's all I wanted to cover today, but thanks, Sally. I'll answer some questions.
Thank you, Samantha. I think you've just about answered all the questions I had, but just going back to the fact that magazines were actually labelled as non-essential during lockdown and weren't in stores at all, or that supplies dwindled over lockdown. Do you think the fact that they were labelled non-essential will impact people's perception of them and their sales long term, even leaving aside all those other factors that you've talked about, like the recessionary mindset?
Yeah, so I've actually got another couple of slides because I was just thinking around people may want to see what the impact of on magazines was during COVID. So I don't know if we can just show those extra couple of slides I've got, but you know, magazines did take a hit during COVID. They were down around 2.5 million off the top of my head, and there we go. So around 13%. And it was those larger publications. And of course, with Bauer exiting the market and also the availability, we did see some pretty stark declines across there. But I think in terms of when we think about essential things and all of the things that I've already spoken about, is that there is really a place for magazines, and if magazines and media can really leverage some of those key trends that I've already spoken about, that we've kind of had reinvigorated into our lives, that's when those magazines will become important and essential. And if we look at the next slide, which is actually the segments that have really delivered growth, it's all around these hobbies, you know, crafts and hobbies. The total quarter was up, but actually level 1 remained elevated. Current affairs, we've digested a lot of current affairs over this period. Everyone's been tuning in, and we've seen even accelerated growth under level 1. So it's not that we're just stuck at home with nothing to do. We've got reignited interest in there. And that goes the same with home and lifestyle. So, you know, we want to fix up our house, so we want some inspiration for that. And food and wine, again, we've got different needs around food and wine. So, okay, it wasn't classified as an essential service. I don't think people are really thinking like that from a typical consumer perspective. I think the Bauer noise also rung true, because people were like, well, okay, that company's not selling anymore, therefore it's not available. So I think there's a bit of uncertainty from a consumer perspective. But I think just moving forward, there are a lot of opportunities in terms of magazines, leveraging some of these new behaviours and the thirst for information as well from a current affairs perspective.
And just delving into that recessionary mindset some more, and you've talked about people buying in bulk and cheaper deals and that sort of thing. I don't know whether it's a myth in magazine land, but I've always heard that during a recession, people like to splash on little luxuries like lipsticks and magazines rather than big luxuries. Do you see any evidence of that sort of buying?
Yeah, so we have seen, not so much from a magazine perspective this time around. We're only in early days of the kind of potential recession that we're going to hit. But we have seen a lot of people wanting those antidotes to reality. So the little treats, chocolate bars, biscuits, there's been quite a few, and baking as well, because that is a treat at the end of something that you have accomplished. In terms of magazine sales, if we look back to the global financial crisis in 2008, I know it was a different world back then, but we did see magazine sales slightly down at 3%. So I guess if that's something to go by, we might need to be a little bit mindful of the impact. But having said that, we are in a different world. We have had all of these reignited new interests. We are going to be staying at home more. We want those little treats for ourselves. So there's a lot of opportunities that we can kind of leverage in this space. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Who knows what's going to happen? But magazines they're not expensive. It's not like going out and buying a car or something really expensive like that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Samantha. There were some great insights there. Perfect. Okay, and we'll move now on to our third panelist, who's Nick Whitehead from Nielsen. Now, I think we all know Nielsen as the global measurement company that provides our print readership currency in New Zealand. Nick is a senior member of the company's commercial development team in this country. He's also the lead for Nielsen's publisher-client relationships. And Nielsen continued their readership measurement with some slightly different methodologies, such as dropping face-to-face interviews throughout the pandemic period. And Nick's here to talk about some of those early results.
Thanks, Sally. Okay, I'll get those slides up. Fantastic. Before we jump into the first slide, just a little bit of background in terms of this particular analysis. So, as Sally mentioned, we obviously do the readership currency for New Zealand. We obviously measure a lot of other media as well, right across outdoor media, TV, radio, right across the board. And in certain media, obviously you can get next day results, TV and online being the most obvious. However, with readership, we release on a quarterly basis. So usually that's obviously fine, but in a situation like COVID-19, it would have been a very long wait to get the results to see what the impact actually was on readership and consumption habits. So after talking to the industry, the MPA and the MPA, and see what we could potentially do here, we did an early dip analysis. So we can actually see what the results were actually during lockdown on people's consumption, particularly around readership. So that's what this analysis is I'll be going through right now. So if you go to the first slide, please. Just go through, I might go through methodology, I'll go straight to the next one and the next one. Cool. All right, so we had a look at daily papers and magazines. Now I'll run through daily papers first. And as I mentioned, obviously we want to see what was actually happening during lockdown. What was the impact? Were people behaving differently? Were they consuming differently? And so on this slide here, you can see on the left side, we've just got the trended data, typically by quarter, as I said, what the results were in terms of how many Kiwis read a daily a newspaper in your average week. So in our first analysis, we look to the left side of this slide here. The right side. The left is just a trend, so you can see what the numbers were. But looking at the right side, what we've done is before level 4. This is the Q1 results, and during level 4, the last part of Q1, and we can see before level 4, typically 42% of Kiwis read a newspaper on your average week. So pretty much in line with what you're seeing the rest of 2019. Come the lockdown, that rose to 50%. And then as we moved to basically quarter 2, and that was from late April through the end of May, that rose to 55%. Now, we haven't seen that level of readership in daily newspapers, well, not for a number of years, actually. So the importance of news and current affairs is really clear. It's no surprise that people were desperate to find out what was going on. They trusted newspapers. Newspapers were the only source, obviously, but in terms of the numbers we were seeing consuming news through newspapers, we actually saw a great increase, and that's a fantastic number for newspapers to go to the market with. Next slide. Same thing here, same format. On the left side, you see the trend. This slide is about media usage. When I talk about media usage, what we're talking about is a heavy, medium, light type usage. Those that are heavier, consuming 4+ copies a week, and then you get medium, light, and nil. So again, what we saw here was the impact and obviously the appetite for New Zealanders to get their news and read a daily newspaper. So again, typically before lockdown, first quarter of this year, very similar in terms of the numbers, heavy, medium, light, roughly, let's say 20%. Come lockdown, that rose to 30%. And the other interesting thing that if you look down that bottom, the grey box, I haven't seen numbers this low for nil newspaper readership for a very long time. Come dip 2, it's the early part of Q2 from April through to May, as we're in that lockdown period, 45% nil. Typically that's been 55% really again for the last 3 years. So again, you're actually getting people back into reading newspapers, which is quite a statement to say, as we see obviously people move to many different habits. But when you see that number down to 45, that's actually a marked change in people's consumption habits of newspapers. Don't know whether it'll continue, but it was quite amazing to see that number come through, as well as the 30% for heavy readership as well. And that came down to people's time, actually having time at home to read the newspaper. We all know generally we're all really busy. Reading more than 4 copies a week has become a luxury for most people. During lockdown, we actually saw that increase from roughly 20 to 30%, which was a big number, and actually get people back into reading newspapers. So quite amazing results for the newspaper industry. Next slide, please. This is another one. We look at, obviously news is not just the newspaper, the traditional media publishers aren't just print these days, also have an online arm. So we had a look at looking at their brands in terms of consumption across both platforms, whether it be print or online. And again, incredible results. Again, just showing the importance of how people want to consume and the appetite for news and knowing what was happening during this time. So again, we look to the left, you see roughly people that have consumed the news through those traditional sites, online news sites or daily newspapers, roughly seeing 7 out of 10 New Zealanders on an average week are doing it. During the lockdown period, that rose to over 90%. So 9 in 10 New Zealanders were consuming daily newspaper and then news to the traditional local news sites. Again, a massive number, completely out of the norm. So we do expect these to settle back a bit, but the numbers were incredible. And I'll talk a little bit about other media like TV later on in this discussion. But yeah, phenomenal numbers. We share these with the NPA, and obviously their eyes lit up. So a really strong message there for how much people trust and how credible the newspapers' news and current affairs coverage is. Well, if we move to magazines. So again, same analysis. We did the same analysis, obviously, right across print, be it newspaper or magazine. So with magazines, we knew the challenges that magazines were facing. It's just been talked about there as the non-essential, and it was all really about an access issue. So again, we didn't want to wait a full quarter to know what that meant for consumption. So that's why we've done this dip analysis for magazines as well. And as you can see, despite those challenges and access being a clear issue in terms of the titles in the market, it's held up remarkably well. So you look at, again, roughly to the left, we're talking about that high 60s, low 70s as a result. Once you went into level 4, we actually saw an increase in that. So you're talking about 72% of New Zealanders actually reading an issue within the last issue period. And that is, again, really a high number when people are actually struggling to actually access some titles. And then we look at Q2, our early dip analysis into the second quarter, that period there, April through to May, and we're seeing it hold strong. And I think it's actually really remarkable. You may look at it and go, well, it's kind of the average. That's holding the average when access is an almighty issue, which I know that the magazine issue grappled with during the period. So I think that's a really strong result. Next slide, please. Okay, media usage. Now this one shouldn't be a surprise, really. Again, speaking to that, the whole point of access being an issue. When there are less titles in the market, it's going to be a lot harder to be in the heavy readers. Heavy readers being, again, 4 issues or more during the last issue period. That becomes a challenge when you are having struggles actually getting copies of magazines. So actually what we are seeing here is a decrease in the heavy reader, which was really no surprise over that period. However, the medium and the light held pretty strong, which was really good news. And I think probably I wouldn't normally call out the nil readers as something to talk about, but I think it is actually a positive when you see that the nil readers in this particular case didn't change. So we go into level 4, late March, and actually nil readers dropped. So we actually saw an increase in overall readership of magazines, which was a great result. Come Q2, the early dip, we see it sort of settle back to normal. But again, that's in an environment where we're seeing less copies available. So to actually hold that, I think is a really strong result again. Great, next slide, please. Okay, and I think this one is really the standout for magazines. And I think just such a strong statement that you come through. The average time spent reading. Again, a lot of this has to do with, obviously, a lot of us are at home. We were all at home during that period. But it's all about the engagement with people's favourite magazines. And again, look to the left and you see these numbers here. The average time spent reading for 2019 has roughly been 40 minutes. And really, that number hasn't changed for a number of years. Again, it's much like some of the other metrics. It's pretty stable, right? We hit level 4, and that number goes to an hour. And that's not a number I've seen for magazines for quite some time. So again, people are reaching for their favorite magazine. It's something they trust. It's that time or something that they really value. It's a personal thing for them. So it's just incredible sort of statement really about how much people value the magazines, and they value the content. It's that personal sort of passionate sort of area they have a passion for, and that's been held over as well for the Q2 early dip as well. So we're seeing that's actually increased, and that's despite the fact that the access to issues and the number of issues available is a lot less. But the people it's more of a cover to cover story. So what you're seeing there is that the content is consumed cover to cover. People are probably spending more time reading the articles, fully reading the articles. Again, it's a great story for magazines. So I think that's one of the key standouts that we saw when we did this early analysis, is that the engagement level had increased by such an incredible amount. I think that's all I had for dip analysis.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. Listen, I'd like to jump to the question of trust, because we've heard a little bit about that over the last few sessions.
Yep.
And Sinead Boucher pointed it out as, you know, as the most important measurement that you can do in terms of, well, she was talking of stuff generally, but magazines generally do very well in terms of trust metrics, don't they? Can you talk a little bit about what you know about that and how we can measure it?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a media engagement component of our readership currency. And in that, we actually ask about all media across the board. And one of the questions we ask is about trust and credibility, but different media type. And basically on a regularly, basically every time, print media, whether it be newspaper or magazine, and the print and online brands for newspapers and magazines always come up top when we were doing that analysis. TV probably comes in third, but yeah, the print magazines and newspapers always do incredibly well. I think that's to do with, again, from the newspapers, it's because of their news coverage and having those independent, in-depth news stories. Whereas for the magazines, it's again because it's the connection that the people have, the individuals have. It's quite a personal thing when you read a magazine. Whereas news is like, I want to be updated, I want to be informed. People subscribe or buy magazines because it's a personal, passionate area that they're interested in, whether it be fashion, food, home decoration, gossip, whatever. It's something that they're really interested in. It's a personal thing. It's a me time. It's something that they can actually get comfort from. So I think there's real trust. I think magazines done a really good job of engaging with their customers as well. And I know there's a lot of online panels and understanding who their readers are, and they really reach out and have to have that one-on-one communication, often through their social media platforms as well. So I think there's a real trust and a relationship that consumers have with magazines, and that builds trust. And newspapers have that trust as well through credibility.
And I suppose on the flip side to that, we've heard a little bit about fake news and misinformation, particularly on social media, and people, you know, nascent Facebook bans and that sort of thing. Is that just a conversation among the media, or is that something that you're seeing as driving a change in media habits?
I don't think, and again, it's probably New Zealand versus some other parts of the world. It's an issue. There's no doubt about it, and it has been discussed more in New Zealand. Probably not quite the same as it would be in other countries. But obviously, the US is the obvious example where you do have, it's quite rampant tribalism in the States, for example, and you have your Fox Watchers or your MSNBCs, very different, and that's it. You're in that one echo chamber, and there is fake news all over the place. New Zealand, I don't think is quite as bad, and even with you are US or New Zealand, I don't think it's changing so much media habits. I think media habits very much are driven quite a bit by life stage, to be completely honest. A lot of the analysis we do, it is very much a life stage in terms of your media habits and your consumption. But it does have the potential to change the source of media. So probably more mature people still have the print or the TV or again their news or information through that source, whereas younger generation, being completely honest, are certainly online or social media as a big component of their news information. And whilst they may not, I don't think that's going to change, to be honest. That's what they get. That's their warehouse for news. But absolutely, they are all about being authentic. And as soon as they don't see being authentic, they will change who they are following online. And you can see that with influencers. Certainly, Facebook has certainly got some issues at the moment. They're making some changes, but they've been forced, obviously, through advertising dollars. They're making that decision whether how long it lasts, let's see. But yeah, I don't think it'll change media habits as much. Pretty much, yeah, so it's a life stage thing. But who they follow, which is their social media, whether it be social media platforms or Instagram influencers, that will change absolutely based on fake media. And as soon as they think someone's fake or inauthentic, they drop them.
Okay, I think we're just about running out of time now, but I'd like to open a couple of questions just for the whole panel. So if all of you just think 5 years down the track, do you think we're going to look back on this pandemic as a time that drove real social change, or do you think that we'll mostly slip back into our old habits? Jason first. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I think there'll be elements that do change. I think the size of this event means that things will change. But, there will be a lot of stuff that does slip back into the habit. I think when you're trying to spot those things that will change or try to make, prediction about what will change, it's those things that COVID serve as a catalyst to push us towards, rather than things that we just did as a response to COVID. So when I think, working from home, there's a desire for people to do that, and it thrust us all into it and realised it could work. Video calling. The amount of, so I'm back in the office every day now, but I've noticed already, I very rarely just make a cell phone call these days. Many of those meetings that I would have done just as a call, I now do as a video call, because we realise that technology is actually really easy to use now and much more accessible. Does that mean face-to-face meetings are gone? No, but I think it will serve as quite a catalyst, and we will look back in 5 years and go, there was a point in time that changed that for us.
Yeah, thanks. What about you, Samantha? Do you think our shopping habits will slip back into what they were pre-COVID?
A lot of them will, but a lot of them won't as well. So there's always the idealism. Oh, I've just come off my holiday, and I'm going to be healthy and got my New Year's resolutions. And do we ever do it? Well, not really. But there are definitely things that will. I mean, I pretty much, my MD might be on the call here. I'm not going to go back to work 5 days a week because that's 12 hours of my life that I'm in a car because I travel quite far. So what's the point when I can use that to maybe do a bit more work and be more productive, or go to the gym, or start cooking dinner earlier? But I think also with that flexibility just comes that a lot more eating from home, a lot of those kind of at-home occasions, which will lend itself more to buying stuff from the supermarket. And if we're thinking about flying over to Christchurch or Wellington or to Australia for work, what's the purpose of that now? I think people are going to be thinking really hard about all the money that companies have saved. We're going into a recession. Why would we go back? So I think that whole work scenario is going to completely change how we live life. I think the other thing is that from the GFC, a lot of change occurred. Some people are referring to COVID almost as like a war that we're coming out of. Which is because of the health and the wealth issues and all of the long-term things. Pregnancy tests are up as well. So, are those types of things going to have long-lasting effects into the future around how we treat our money, what's important to us, those types of things?
Thank you. I think we'd better leave it there. I think we need to allow a few minutes before the next session. James, do you want to spruik the next session?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, first of all, to Nick, to Samantha and Jason. Some really fascinating insights there, and really great to see some of the data coming out, which actually is quite positive, I think, in most cases in terms of the speed of recovery. Certainly for us sitting on the other side of the world where all of that feels a very long way away still, it's good to know that that's possible. You will have seen in the chat that we posted a link to the report that FIPP created on the global perspective of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it's had on the industry. I would encourage you to go and download that, and you'll get a kind of summary of the insights that we've had so far. And thank you to the panelists, because we will certainly be adding some of the insights that you've taken, you've brought with us today to the next edition of that report. We're going to now take a half-an-hour break. The next session starts at 3 p.m. New Zealand time, which is the horrifying time of 4 a.m. UK time. So we'll be back in about half an hour. And it is a very good session, very similar to what you've heard just now, some more insights on content usage and the changes in consumption habits during COVID from Nikolai at Pressreader. So we will jump off now and be back for the final session of the final day of FIPP Insider New Zealand in about half an hour. Thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you to Sally, and we'll see you at 3 p.m. New Zealand time. Goodbye.